Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversation with Memo. We have a very timely and relevant topic for us to pick through today, global Islamophobia. And I can think of no better person to guide us through this topic than our guest today, Professor S Syyid. I'm delighted to have him on our show today. Professor Syyid is a decolonial political theorist based in the University of Leeds. His major publications include A Fundamental Fear, Thinking Through Islamophobia, and Recalling the Caliphate. He's also the founding editor of an interdisciplinary journal called Reoriented. Professor Syyid, welcome to our show.
Thank you, welcome. I'm very well honored to be here.
Pleased to have you. Pleased to have you. So before we enter into the meat of our conversation, the geopolitics of Islamophobia, can you help us define the term itself? What is Islamophobia? Phobia, as we know, is an illogical, irrational fear of something. So what does it mean to say someone is displaying phobia of Islam?
I think we have to get away from understanding words by their etymology. So for example, television means distant vision. But when I say television to you, you don't think distant vision. You think about a box which gives you pictures and audio and has programs and things like that. Similarly, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism means prejudice against people who are Jewish or of Jewish heritage, even though one of the largest Semitic languages is in fact Arabic. So in a way, it does no longer mean anti-Semitic, doesn't mean anti-Arab or anti-speaking, it means anti-Jewish. So I think the first thing I would say to you that trying to understand words by breaking them down into their etymology isn't really how words work in the culture. So in a sense, Islamophobia, so it's a bit of a red herring when people talk about phobia is irrational or things like that, because there are many, many words which you can't reduce to their etymology. A number of ways of understanding Islamophobia. The one that I would favor right now is really the idea of thinking about Islamophobia as a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And I think it's important that we talk about Muslimness because it's not really about Muslims. So for example, after 9/11, one of the first people killed in retaliation, as it was supposed to be for 9/11, was actually a Sikh garage, who owned a garage in the United States. And the reason he was killed is because he wore a turban, he had a beard, and racists are not always that literate. And they thought that this man they were killing was a Muslim because the marker of Muslimness for them was beard and turban. So I think that's the first thing I would want to say. And the second thing is about racism. I think we have to understand racism is really, it's about the process of racialization. It's not that races already exist, they're actually made racialized. So if you think about Muslims now, or people who look like Muslims, or people who are perceived to be Muslims, try going through airports. This is before COVID, we could go through airports, let's say. There was a whole panoply of techniques and things to spot a Muslim. So in a way, the Muslims were becoming, the Muslim body, male and female, was becoming racialized. So in that sense, Islamophobia, it seems to me, the most useful way to understand it is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness.
So I guess what we're saying is that definitions are a creative process. They don't just simply exist out there. We have to create definitions which suit the time and needs of what we're seeing around the world at the moment. And Islamophobia, hatred towards Muslim, has a specific manifestation. But I guess, what would you say to those people who say, but Islam isn't a race, you can shoehorn race into it, but Islam is first and foremost a religion, it's an idea. So why bring race into it? Muslims are so vast, so different.
Sure, because the problem is this, that one of the issue about races is that it's not that races exist and then you have racism. It's racism that creates races. So for example, that we frame and organize people using certain markers compared to other markers is actually a process of racism. It is actually racialization, that we create racism creates races. And what we're seeing now and I'll give you an example in a minute, is that you have the racialization of Muslimness. To give you an example, you may have, many people who are watching this may have seen this video on YouTube clip a couple of, I think maybe a year ago. Basically a man in London going on a rant against Muslims, but he was in front of a school, and you know, it's mainly Muslim school children, many Muslim young students wearing the hijab, etc. So he's following them and he's sort of ranting these things. But the things he's saying, things like that, is, well, he's not making theological points. He's not saying how dare they believe they don't accept Jesus Christ, or how dare they believe in the oneness of God. He's talking about how they're outbreeding. He's talking about why they need to be sterilized. So he's using the language, which is quite common around the language of racism in terms of that. He's seeing them not as a religious faith or a community of conviction. It's not a theological dispute he has with them. It's completely a dispute about their existence, about them breeding, etc. Those kind of metaphors that are really, really embedded through racism. So I think it's a bit of a red herring to talk about, well, Muslims are not a race. Of course, Muslims are not a race, but to be honest with you, nobody is a race in a sense. Race is socially constructed, historically constructed, and they work over time. So for example, even on the census data, if you look at the UK census data, it has really peculiar categories. It has a category called Indian or a category called Pakistani, but these are not races. Both Indian, Pakistani, or Bangladeshi, they are actually in themselves in national categories, but they're treated for the purposes of the UK census as racial categories or ethnic categories. So I think we have to be aware of the way in which races are socially constructed. And what we are often dealing with is not races, but inheritances of process of racialization. And what we're seeing with Islamophobia is the racialization of Muslimness, because that's how people can read this out. So for example, they will look at a Muslim woman, they don't, or a Muslim man, they don't really engage with their views about theology or faith. It is that they see them in particular ways, they read them in particular ways, they dress in particular ways. They come from a particular part of a city or a local neighborhood. They come from, you know, they're considered to eat certain kinds of foods, etc. And leaving aside this rather surreal, crazy stuff that somehow comes out that, you know, eating halal food will turn you into a Muslim, this sort of thing that, you know, often you find on the on websites and things like that among kind of far right people.
Websites.
We've all heard of them. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on something the European, not European, the Equality and Human Rights Commission on Anti-Semitism, the report on anti-Semitism last week. I think it goes to, it speaks to the opposition against having any kind of formal definition of anti-Semitism. I'm making that comparison because that report, as you probably would have read, said that, you know, examples of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party include questioning the fact that anti-Semitism is exaggerated by the media itself, that in itself is indicative of racism within the Labour Party. In other words, questioning the very existence of the problem was itself evident of anti-Semitism. That's quite a bold thing to say, in my view. So for me, in contrast with Islamophobia, there's no such recognition of protection extended to Muslims against this kind of hate speech. Prominent journalists, for example, are able to publish articles on the mainstream media saying that the concept of Islamophobia is itself anti-Semitic. For example, there was an article a couple of months back. So why do you see this, such a strong resistance to having any kind of formal definition of anti-Islamophobia, which you've been trying to advocate for some time?
Well, I think there are two things. I think firstly, definitions are not necessarily the same thing. What we're talking about is how people understand things. So that's probably a more useful way. So for example, in this country now, after 50 years of struggle, most people have some idea of what racism is. If you go to a football match in the Premiership, when there were crowds, if someone say throws banana or something like that, people can read that and say, well, actually, this is racism. When they were doing that 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it was thought to be a bit of fun, a bit of banter. Yeah. So now you may have stewards, if someone throws a banana at black players, evicting those who are doing this. They would not have done that 20 years ago, for sure. And you can look at the experience of black players who will tell you the horror stories. So what's happened is this, that the consciousness of the community has been transformed. And the same people who would deny this was anything wrong with it now recognize there's something wrong with it. Now, that is different than having a legal definition. Most people do not have a legal definition understanding of racism. 10-year-old children do not have a legal definition understanding of racism, but they kind of understand what racism is, and they're able to point it out. So I think similarly with Islamophobia is what you need is not so much a definition which is legally binding, because that comes afterwards. What you need is actually an awareness in the community, in the society, in general way, that look, this is what Islamophobia is. And it is a type of racism because we've already done that kind of work. We can see the same kinds of things. Yeah. You're quite right that there is a contestation of this. The reason, you have to remember this, that every single advance in anti-racism was contested. We always pretend that everybody was against racism, but that wasn't the case. In the 70s, when, for example, legislation in this country was introduced against racial racism, all the comedians were coming out and saying this would be the death of comedy, or there were stories that you wouldn't be able to order black coffee anymore, or there's all this kind of paraphernalia. You wouldn't be able to do anything about crime. You wouldn't be able to do all of these things. So it was constantly contested. It was considered to be, racism was considered to be an infringement of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, etc., etc., etc. So there's nothing new in that. I think the problem right now is that we live in a very kind of presentist culture in which many of our media or other kind of opinion makers don't either reflect back, because they never really cared about that much about these things, and don't actually see that long journey. They're not aware of that 50-year plus struggle, and you could even argue longer than that, to actually change people's understanding. So I think there is opposition to Islamophobia, but why shouldn't there be opposition to Islamophobia? Because in a sense, it's the same opposition there was to homophobia. There was the same opposition to outlawing of anti-Semitism, and there's a so it is part of the course, because ultimately what we're talking about in Islamophobia is wanting justice for people who are denied justice. And the expansion of justice is never, if it's going to be meaningful, it's not going to be uncontested. Yeah. So you can see, for example, the EHRC's come out on talking about anti-Semitism, but look at the Tory party's record on Islamophobia. Right. Some of you remember that in the leadership contest for the leader of the Conservative Party, Sajid Javid asked at this sort of
live on TV, it was that pledge.
Yeah, live on TV, where we can all remember. He asked everybody and they all agreed. Now, I don't know, but you're better informed than I am, but I haven't seen any kind of movement on that issue. And all of this was put down, well, it's too difficult to define, we don't know what it is, etc., etc., etc. So I think we need to be aware.
And it's not as though Muslim organizations haven't called for it. A number of prominent Muslim organizations have called for a similar and equivalent report on Islamophobia within the Conservatives. But as you rightly point out, there hasn't been any move towards that.
Yeah, it hasn't been picked up by the sort of broadsheets or even the kind of, Fleet Street generally. It hasn't really snowballed that the good and the great of the country, have picked it up. At the same time, we have a situation where, not very long ago, prominent left-wing columnists would write columns saying, I am proud to be an Islamophobe. You cannot imagine a universe in which they would write that I'm proud to be an anti-Semite, or I'm proud to, So I think we have to understand there's a contested terrain because Islamophobia is playing a particular part in society right now. And that is what the issue is. That is what's causing all of this.
And I'd like to turn to that now, actually. In the next 15 minutes I would take a look at the broader reason why there is such a pushback against this. Which is I think goes back to the topic of today, global Islamophobia. First of all, I mean, can we speak of anti-Muslim racism in a way that casts Islamophobia as a kind of force that has geopolitical ramifications? Is it as vast as that?
Well, I mean, I think I'm very cautious about talking about anti-Muslim racism because, like I said to you, it's not about Muslims per se, it's about Muslimness. And they're two different things. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. Because there is a family resemblance all over the world in which Islamophobia circulates. So if you look at what's happening in Kashmir, they often use the same justifications or what the Israelis use, government use in Palestine, or what the use has been of the Burmese government against the Rohingya, or what is being done to the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. So it's not that these things are unaffected. They are connected, not in a sort of conspiratorial way, but simply that they're using similar kinds of techniques. It's the way that, for example, torture, you can see how torture flows from from France, what the French were doing in Algeria, to what the East Germans do later on, that there's a kind of, like any technique, there's a circulation on these things. So all of these flow. So there's the first thing I would say to you, that Islamophobia now exists in the world, and it is used by societies to try and explain why they're not able to achieve this kind of modernization, westernization, etc. What is the major blockage there? And when they need to explain these things, they have the very, very similar metaphor Muslim question, as Anne put it in her book, the Muslim problem, and the problem of terrorism, the problem of lack of modernity. So if I wanted to have Macron's speech, you delete the part, Macron, and you put it in some of the Chinese or the Burmese, you will get a similar kind of take.
So I suppose what we're saying is that there's a template of anti-Muslim narrative, probably born out of 9/11, which has been used.
I don't think it's born out of, Nassim, I don't think it's born out of 9/11. I think that's really one of the problems that I want to say is this. Islamophobia is not a response to 9/11. Islamophobia is a response to the assertion of Muslim public identity. That's what the issue is. It is a response to the fact that Muslims have begun for processes which are not local to diasporic populations, but they're kind of long-standing, have begun to articulate themselves as Muslims. So if you think in the 60s, there were, even in the sort of so-called Muslim world, people didn't think of themselves as Muslims in the same way. They thought of themselves as national identities. You can think of it. What you have subsequently, in Europe, for example, there were no Muslims until about the end of the 80s, early 90s. And what I mean by that is people were classified by being either Maghrebi or Senegalese or Kurdish or Turkish or Pakistani or Bangladeshi, where they were. It wasn't that they were considered to have something in common with them. It is the emergence of the category of Muslim, which is a global category, which is the real driver here, I would argue, rather than 9/11, etc. I think because, so just to give you one example, if Islamophobia is a response to 9/11, why is it the Runnymede report in 1997 in this country, which is the major coinage of the term of Islamophobia, comes in 1997, 4 years before 9/11. So they're already responding to something which is happening, which is before 9/11.
I guess what you're saying kind of speaks
Islamophobia, was also used in 1985 by Edward Said in his book on Orientalism, the second edition of that in 1985. Again, this is before 9/11. So I think there's lots of historical examples you can see that this term is circulating prior to 9/11. Now, maybe 9/11 more visible, but 9/11 doesn't explain what's happened to the Rohingya. There's no kind of linkage in that way. The linkage is in terms of the way that it's expressed.
So would it be right to say that the geopolitics of Islamophobia kind of refers to a narrative and the tools that's employed by many regional and global powers to advance colonial objectives and expand their authority and control. So would it be right to connect, for example, the Chinese persecution of Uyghur and also Rohingya and also what's happening in Palestine as a way of saying that they are instrumentalizing the anti-Muslim hatred in a way that wasn't being used in the past?
I mean, I'm not sure that they're instrumentalizing it. Instrumentalizing means suggesting that they're away from it, that they're different, they're actually using it. When I would say to you, it actually constitutes their projects. So one way to think about Islamophobia, it seems to me, or part of it, is that neo-nationalist projects throughout the planet express themselves and their rationale through an idea that there is a Muslim problem, a Muslim menace. And the thing about the Muslims, which is most disturbing, is that they somehow escape the nation. They are constitutional, and that is the only problem. Every single government involved in Islamophobia, whether it's in the Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, or elsewhere, wants to nationalize Islam. So you can see that the latest iteration of that is Macron's law of separatism. But all the historical projects have always been about cutting off Muslims and trying to contain them in the nation state. And the failure to do that, that is what aroused part of the problem. So why is it that people like, who supported Trump, suddenly, if you notice the Islamophobia, in a sense, the feeling of Islamophobia increases, not after 9/11, but a couple of years after 9/11. It is to do with the fact that you have, for example, number of states in the United States passing legislation against Sharia law, even when there's no Muslims in the, or virtually no Muslims in the state.
Yeah.
And there's no demand for Sharia law. So there is this kind of global discourse around neo-nationalism in which Muslims represent multiculturalism. They represent all that prevents the nation being constituted around its very kind of narrow ethos. So when, for example, Trump puts Muslims and Mexicans and others out together, migrants, he is simply repeating what someone like Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands have been doing, etc. Multiculturalists. That's the project. This is what Breivik talks about. All the shooters who've been going, they've put these things together. So Muslimness is really this kind of contestation around the boundaries of what a nation will be in this kind of world which is becoming increasingly post-Western. So in every single case where you see Islamophobia being enacted, it is that the nation is being written on the bodies of Muslimness, normally on the bodies of Muslim women, but also others. And that is something which is a common feature.
And then, in what way then are Muslim majority countries peddling this? What comes to my mind immediately is the UAE government who following Macron's intervention last week, saying that Islam has a problem and Muslims are separating themselves from the French Republic and dividing themselves, living in ghettos. The UAE was the only country to back Macron's speech of the Muslim countries. So they're quite happy to do that, it seems to me. I mean, are they just one example, or are there many examples of Muslim countries who are also peddling Islamophobia to secure their interests and also deny Muslims, disenfranchise Muslims?
I think there are many, many examples. I think some of the most prominent Islamophobes have been Muslim countries historically and also contemporary. Look, right now, throughout the Muslim populations, you have a huge contest going on between forces of absolutism, whether they're monarchies or presidential power monarchies, etc., versus those with all the kind of caveats, forces of accountability, right? And the ones of the absolutists will do anything to stay in power. There is no doubt about it. But they also fear Muslimness because partly it underwrites and delegitimizes them. So they wish to create these kind of nationalist, neo-nationalist projects, which really would only have Muslims in their images. And you can see this in many, many different ways. So it shouldn't surprise us, the UAE, but before that, you know, many other, the Ba'athist regimes, for example, were very, very problematic in relation to that. Parts of Arab nationalism was there, or Turkish nationalism up till about 15 years ago had a very problematic relationship with the Muslims. What's happening in Bangladesh, you can see those kind of tensions being played out. What is the role of Muslimness in the construction of these countries? And whether that Muslimness is considered to be something that can be tamed by the political elites, or it is something, because it is so huge, because it's transnational, it cannot be controlled by any one government, which then creates problems of legitimacy, etc. So I think that's one of the biggest tensions around this, and you can see that in the common alliances.
Is that the biggest difference, would you say, between Islamophobia that existed, which Syyid speaks about in Orientalism in the past, where anti-Muslim hatred was kind of a religious prejudice against individuals, but now it's almost kind of state-led? Is that the transformation that you see, where in the past it wasn't state-led, now you have countries around the world which are peddling Islamophobia in a way which governments previously would not have done, and it's become almost an accepted global discourse? Is that the big shift you see from how Islamophobia, of course Islamophobia has been around from, you know, from the colonial period for many, many centuries, but is that the shift you see now?
I'm not sure Islamophobia has been around for many, many centuries. I mean, I think that's, because for me, there's a, well, firstly, there is different kinds of Orientalism, for example, which I talks about, has a different kind of pedigree. It responds to different kinds of situations. But there's some people who argue that Islamophobia is, you know, there's no point in talking about the, you know, the enemies of the Prophet as being Islamophobic. It doesn't make any sense to talk about the Quraysh being Islamophobic. I think Islamophobia is a contemporary phenomenon. And what I mean by contemporary, it's certainly about 150, maybe 100 years old, maybe less. It's about that range rather than many, many centuries. And the reason is this, because the way that the Muslim appears, the figure of the Muslim, I'm not talking about a specific Muslim, is very, very different now than it was before. And that's the central difference. So Islamophobia is, like I said, is occasioned by a kind of primacy of a Muslim political or public identity. That's the real challenge. That's what Islamophobia fears. It's trying to discipline and regulate how Muslimness can be expressed publicly. And that's what's driving it in this way right now. So, you know, there are many, and the thing is that, for example, the Kemalists in Turkey were in the, you know, from 1924 were carrying out projects that they wanted to more or less domesticate and erase independent Muslimness. That's what the project was. And many, many countries follow the Kemalists. In Reza Shah in Iran, you know, many, many of the regimes in the Arab world, etc. They were following that pattern because they thought to be modern meant to be non-religious. And for them, they took what the Westerners said about religion. Islam is a religion. Therefore, to get rid of Islam was a way of becoming modern. That's kind of narrative around that. And the picture isn't that.
I have a final thought just before we conclude. I mean, you've been working on this for a number of years. To me, it seems the situation is going to get worse with regards to the number of Islamophobic or hostility towards Muslims generally throughout Europe and the world. And what would you say to people who want to combat Islamophobia? What are the things they should be doing to raise this as an issue and solve this as an issue? Just to wrap up before we, so can I have thoughts on that?
The short answer to this is that what people need to do to raise this is to be politically engaged, is to actually stop pretending that this is not an issue. I think one of the problems is that many, many Muslims are still in the stage of denial. They often follow the narrative, well, you know, if we keep our heads down, if we don't say anything, it'll go away. or they're constantly talking about it as though this is the victim card, etc., etc. Let us understand Islamophobia is racism. Racism is not unprovoked. It's not that you do something and then someone becomes a racist. So that's the first thing. If we recognize that it is racism, then what it opens up is a learning path by other kind of anti-racist struggles in history, the civil rights movement, the anti-colonial movements, and how they actually combated and transformed various iterations of racism. It doesn't mean they finished, but they changed the landscape. And I think it's incumbent upon not just Muslims, but also non-Muslims and anyone who cares for justice to understand that the threat that Islamophobia poses is not to Muslims. It is to a way of life. It basically is redefining the relationship between citizens and governments. And that is what is absolutely key here. And Islamophobia then becomes simply a initial step in doing that. So to combat Islamophobia is really necessary because you want to preserve a degree of ultimately freedom and justice in any particular society.
With that, I have to conclude. We've come to the end of our time. I really want to thank Professor Syyid for joining us, and I want to thank our viewers at home. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.